Goldwin Smith was a British historian and journalist, active in the United Kingdom and Canada. Early years. Smith was born at Reading, Berkshire. He was educated at Eton College and Magdalen College, Oxford, and after a brilliant undergraduate career, he was elected to a fellowship at University College, Oxford. He threw his energy into the cause of university reform with another fellow of University College, Arthur Penrhyn Stanley, on the Royal Commission of 1850 to inquire into the reform of the university, of which Stanley was secretary. Smith served as assistant secretary, and he was then secretary to the commissioners appointed by the Act of 1854. His position as an authority on educational reform was further recognized by a seat on the Popular Education Commission of 1858. In 1868, when the question of reform at Oxford was again growing acute, he published a pamphlet entitled The Reorganization of the University of Oxford. In 1865, he led the University of Oxford opposition to a proposal to develop Cripley Meadow north of Oxford railway station for use as a major site of Great Western Railway workshops. His father had been a director of GWR. Instead, the workshops were located in Swindon. He was public with his pro-Northern sympathies during the American Civil War, notably in a speech at the Free Trade Hall, Manchester, in April 1863, and his letter to a Whig member of the Southern Independence Association the following year. Besides the abolition of tests effected by the Act of 1871, many of the reforms suggested, such as the revival of the faculties, the reorganization of the professoriate, the abolition of celibacy as a condition of the tenure of fellowships, and the combination of the colleges for lecturing purposes, were incorporated in the Act of 1877, or subsequently adopted by the university. Smith gave the counsel of perfection that pass examinations ought to cease, but he recognized that this change must wait on the reorganization of the educational institutions immediately below the university, at which a passman ought to finish his career. His aspiration that colonists and Americans should be attracted to Oxford was later realized by the will of Cecil Rhodes, on what is perhaps the vital problem of modern education, the question of ancient versus modern languages. He pronounced that the latter are indispensable accomplishments, but they do not form a high mental training, an opinion entitled to peculiar respect as coming from a president of the Modern Language Association, Regius Professor. He held the Regius Professorship of Modern History at Oxford from 1858 to 1866, that ancient history, besides the still unequaled excellence of the writers, is the best instrument for cultivating the historical sense. As a historian, indeed, he left no abiding work. The multiplicity of his interests prevented him from concentrating on any one subject. His chief historical writings, The United Kingdom, A Political History, and The United States, An Outline of Political History, though based on thorough familiarity with this subject, make no claim to original research, but are remarkable examples of terse and brilliant narrative. The outbreak of the American Civil War proved a turning point in his life. Unlike most of the ruling classes in England, he championed the cause of the North, and his pamphlets, especially one entitled Does the Bible Sanction American Slavery?, played a prominent part in converting English opinion. Visiting America on a lecture tour in 1864, he received an enthusiastic welcome, and was entertained at a public banquet in New York. In 1868 he threw up his career in England and settled in the United States, where he held the professorship of English and Constitutional History in the Department of History at Cornell University for a number of years. Goldwin Smith Hall, which is located in Cornell's Arts Quad, is named in his honor. In 1871 he moved to Toronto, where he edited the Canadian Monthly, and subsequently founded The Week and The Bystander, and where he spent the rest of his life living in the Grange Manor. Politics. He continued to take an active interest in English politics. As a Liberal, he opposed Benjamin Disraeli, and was a strong supporter of Irish disestablishment, but refused to follow Gladstone in accepting Home Rule. He expressly stated that, if he ever had a political leader, his leader was John Bright, not Mr. Gladstone. Speaking in 1886, he referred to his standing by the side of John Bright against the dismemberment of the great Anglo-Saxon community of the West, as I now stand against the dismemberment of the great Anglo-Saxon community of the East. These words formed the key to his views of the future of the British Empire, and he was a leading light of the anti-imperialist Little Englander movement. He always maintained that Canada, separated by great barriers running north and south into 4 zones, each having unimpeded communication with the adjoining portions of the United States, was a profoundly artificial and badly governed nation, that was destined by its natural configuration to enter into a commercial union with the U.S. This would in turn result in her breaking away from the British Empire, and in the union of the Anglo-Saxons of the American continent into one great nation. These views are most fully stated in his Canada and the Canadian Question. Though describing himself as anti-imperialistic to the core, he was yet deeply penetrated with the sense of the greatness of the British race, of the British Empire in India. He said that, "It is the noblest the world has seen." Never had there been such an attempt to make conquest the servant of civilization. About keeping India there is no question. England has a real duty there. His fear was that England would become a nation of factory workers, thinking more of the trade union than of the country. He was also opposed to Britain granting more representative government to India, expressing fear that this would lead to a murderous anarchy. His opinion of British activity in the Transvaal was well voiced in the Canadian press and in his book In the Court of History, An Apology of Canadians Opposed to the Boer War. This work is a fascinating articulation of pacifist opposition to the Second Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902. It is important because it is amongst the few expressions of opposition to war from the perspective of an Anglo-colonial settler. Smith was anti-Semitic and believed Jews needed to assimilate within nation-states rather than existing as a nation within nations. He had a strong influence on Mackenzie King and Henry Bourassa. He proposed elsewhere that Jews and Arabs were of the same race. He also believed that Islamic oppression of non-Muslims was due to economic factors. These anti-imperialist prolegomena were intensified and made manifest in his Commonwealth or Empire, a warning to the United States against the assumption of imperial responsibilities. Other causes that he powerfully attacked were liquor prohibition, female suffrage and state socialism. All these are discussed in his essays on questions of the day. He also published sympathetic monographs on William Cowper and Jane Austen, and attempted verse in bay leaves and specimens of Greek tragedy. In his guesses at the riddle of existence, he abandons the faith in Christianity expressed in his lecture of 1861 on historical progress, and writes in a spirit not of agnosticism, if agnosticism imports despair of spiritual truth, but of free and hopeful inquiry, the way for which it is necessarily to clear, by removing the wreck of that upon which we can found our faith no more. Later years. In his later years he expressed his views in a weekly journal, The Farmer's Son, and published in 1904 My Memory of Gladstone. while occasional letters to the Spectator showed that he had lost neither his interest in English politics and social questions nor his remarkable gifts of style. He died at his residence in Toronto, The Grange. Goldwin Smith is credited with the quote, "Above all nations is humanity," an inscription that was engraved in a stone bench he offered to Cornell in May 1871. The bench sits in front of Goldwin Smith Hall, named in his honor. This quote is the motto of the University of Hawaii and other institutions around the world. Another stone bench inscribed with the motto sits on the campus of Boğaziçi University in Istanbul. It sits with a clear view down onto the city. After his death, a plaque in his memory was erected outside his birthplace in the town center of Reading. This still exists outside the entrance to the Harris Arcade. Works, articles, miscellany, Dalhousie, James Andrew Brown Ramsay, Marquis of. In Encyclopedia Britannica, 9th edition, Volume Vi, New York, Charles Scribner's Sons, 1878, pp. 776–780. Peel, Sir Robert. In Encyclopedia Britannica, 9th edition, Volume 18, New York, Charles Scribner's Sons, 1885, pp. 452–457. Letters of Goldwin Smith to Charles Eliot Norton, Proceedings of the Massachusetts Historical Society, 49, October 1915, June 1916, pp. 106–160.